There are various reasons that can be various points of view and various factors that I think explain why the bishops were opposed to the Sandinistas. I go into this also in the latter part of my book. I try to isolate and identify a number of factors in their own thinking, one of which is a fear of anything smacking of Marxism. They felt that revolutions have always been against the church. They have always ended up persecuting the church, expelling priests, closing down church institutions, and this one will probably be just like the rest. But I think in that they failed to recognize the involvement and participation of Christians in the Nicaraguan revolution. There was something new and different in the Nicaraguan revolution. And yet the bishops still seem to be thinking in these old categories, that revolutionaries are bound to be against the church, to be against religion, and they will ultimately try to put the churches out of business. But also there were some Sandinistas, there was a small sector of the Sandinistas who spoke that kind of language. A small sector that I would say were, probably some of them still are, strongly anti-clerical and against religion, and who don't see any value in the church, and who speak out against religion. But that was only a small sector within Sandinismo. But if some bishop heard a Sandinista sergeant or somebody talking against the church and saying this is all superstition and we're going to put you out of business as soon as we can, they would generalize from that and say, well, that's what we're up against, so our fears are confirmed when we need to work against this new Sandinista government. In one case, for instance, in the central mountains of Nicaragua, this was after the victory of the insurrection, and a unit of the Sandinista army came through and camped out in the church and ended up taking a statue out of the church that was very dear to the people. And so this is something that the people in that area will never forget. You know, they have not forgotten that was done, and to them it confirmed the fears that had been instilled in the people by the conservative sectors of the clergy. So, but I think the policy of the Frente Sandinista was always very clear. They respected religion, they respected the freedom of religion, they officially recognized the importance of the involvement of Christians in the revolutionary process, and they took the position of being a modern, lay, secular state, that there would be no official religion in Nicaragua, that people were free to choose to be believers or to be non-believers. They asserted the right of people to have that kind of freedom. But I think because of the history of revolutions going against the church, and that in turn being due to the fact that the church generally was against revolutions, and because of a small sector of Sandinismo that was militantly anti-religion, the bishops took that position. They said, well, we have to work against the system because they're really out to put us out of business. A second factor in the opposition of many of the members of the hierarchy against the Sandinistas was, I think, the traditional friendship and association and alliance, if you will, between many of the hierarchy, clergy, and the upper classes. The landowners, the propertied classes, people in business and commerce, the more prosperous sectors of society. And I think they were much more attuned to the complaints and the fears of those people than they were to the aspirations and hopes and joys, really, of the poor, the peasants, the workers, and so forth, in those early years of the Sandinista government. And it's very easy for bishops and clergy to become much more friendly, much better acquainted with the upper classes than with the peasants. I was on a missionary journey, which I do once in a while, out in the central part of the mountains. And it turned out that the chapel where I was celebrating a mission was on the property of one of the large landowners. And so the idea, the peasants came to it, the poor workers, the peasants, came to the chapel in large numbers. But in coming to the chapel, they knew they were coming to the dueños, the owner's property, and that he was largely responsible for the upkeep of the chapel and keeping things nice and orderly and so forth. And then, of course, he invites the priest to have dinner at his home, and you can very easily get caught up in a very close association with the upper classes, and in that way become divorced more and more from the poor. So I think that was another factor. A number of other reasons, I think, were involved there in what became a very strong and militant opposition of the hierarchy, especially Archbishop Obando and Bishop Vega, against the Sandinista government. You remember that in the spring of 1986, when Reagan was trying to get his 100 million passed by Congress for the Contras, 100 million including outright military aid, Cardinal Obando and Bishop Vega were here in the United States giving talks and speaking about the persecution of religion in Nicaragua, which the people in the Christian-based communities felt was simply not true, and we tried to issue statements from our Christian-based communities saying that they do not speak for us. We have a very different view of things. We believe that the Sandinistas fundamentally respect religion, and that they are trying to create a new society involving the values of the gospel and so forth, the values of social justice and equality and freedom. But the bishops kept coming out very strongly, so that when the aid was passed, then a couple of days later, the Sandinista government deported Bishop Vega. And even though that was a very controversial thing, I felt that there was sufficient reason to make that move, because he had gone way beyond criticizing the government, which I would defend for anybody to be able to have the right to criticize their government. But he went beyond that in supporting efforts, supporting a campaign, a war for the violent overthrow of that government. And I think that basically is why he was deported. So it's a mixed bag, as these questions usually are. You can't generalize too much about the position, what is the position of the church. I would say clearly the people in the Christian-based communities, which are essentially poor communities, either in the cities or in the countryside, they were involved in the revolutionary process against the Somoza dictatorship, and in the years of the Sandinista government, they participated in the building of a new society. They participated in the literacy crusade and the vaccination campaigns, other health campaigns, building of schools, neighborhood organizations, and so forth. But the bishops were coming out more and more strongly against the Sandinistas, speaking about atheism and persecution of religion and so forth. Where are we at now? And how do the people in these different sectors feel now? The elections of February of 1990 came as a great surprise to most of us, but I think as you look at the situation and analyze what the people were going through, it perhaps should not have been that great a surprise that the Sandinistas lost. First of all, they were up against a coalition called the UNO, which consisted of 14 political parties. But I think the very reality, the very situation that the country was in was the main factor contributing to the loss of the elections for the Sandinistas. 30,000 people had been killed by then in the war, 30,000 people on both sides of the battlefield, which is what the Sandinistas always counted. They always counted the Contra casualties as well. 30,000 deaths, many thousands of people injured and maimed for life, especially by the landmines that were planted, especially in the rural areas up by the border, and which are still being looked for, and they're still trying to clean up the mountains. That will be a task that will take many years. Very serious economic damages, which the Sandinistas estimated as coming to $17 billion in economic damage, economic losses, due to the war, due to the economic embargo, and the various forms that U.S. hostility expressed itself in. In 1986, just after the Congress, just a few days after the U.S. Congress approved the $100 million for the Contras, the World Court came out with its ruling stating that the United States was guilty of aggression in Nicaragua and should cease and desist and so forth, and that the U.S. would owe damages to Nicaragua. Well, the U.S. by then had walked out of the proceedings. They said they don't have any jurisdiction over us in this matter, and they never took that claim of $17 billion seriously. The Sandinistas, before they went out of office, they had the majority in the Congress. They passed a law saying that the new government would not have the power to simply drop this claim because it had to do with the national patrimony. But that was no problem for the new government. With their majority in the Congress, they changed that law, they repealed that law, and then shortly thereafter, Mrs. Chamorro dropped the claim completely, just dropped the claim on the $17 billion. Not too long ago, the United States forgave Nicaragua a debt of $350 million. So the U.S., first Nicaragua drops the claim on $17 billion, and then the U.S. forgives Nicaragua's debt to the U.S. Agency for International Development of $350 million. That's what power can do, and the United States, has felt no obligation to make war reparations to Nicaragua in keeping with the ruling of the World Court. So I think the elections were not that, they should not have been that great a surprise if we really looked at the reality of Nicaragua. People were in more and more desperate straits economically. Things had been getting very bad during the latter years of the Sandinista period in government. When I went to Nicaragua in 1986, there were still some very helpful subsidies that the government was able to give. But as it began to devote more than 50% of its national budget, of its government budget, to defense, those programs became more and more reduced to a bare minimum and practically went out of existence by 1990. I'm referring to the subsidies for medicines, for instance, the farmacias populares, the people's pharmacies, where people could go with their prescription and get most, if not all, of their medicines at a very low price due to the government subsidy. Similarly, every household had its ration card, which didn't mean that it was limited to the ration that the government had approved. It just meant that with that card, they could get a certain limited amount of food, soap, cooking oil, other things, at a very low price, according to the number of people in their household. If they had money, they could go out into the market and buy as much as they wanted. But those programs were still in existence when I got there in 1986. By 1990, they had dwindled to practically nothing. Very small quantities of food was available at this low subsidized price. So people were just literally at the end of their rope. I think they were exasperated. They knew that if Daniel Ortega and the other Sandinista candidates got reelected in February of 1990, the war might very well go on. There was no guarantee whatsoever that the Bush administration would recognize the legitimacy of a Sandinista victory, in spite of the presence of thousands of international observers, Jimmy Carter, members of Congress, people from various councils of churches were down there. Still, people felt that if they voted for Daniel, it might very well be a vote for ongoing, indefinite warfare. And as I said, 30,000 people had already died on both sides. And people thought that somehow the economy might improve if Mrs. Chamorro became president, because she was clearly the favorite of the United States, and maybe perhaps the United States would help more, and maybe things would get a little better. There are other reasons, too, for the grievances and opposition against the Sandinistas, which they themselves have recognized in their current process of soul-searching and self-questioning and self-examination, self-scrutiny, which I think is very healthy. The Sandinistas themselves have spoken about what they call a kind of verticalism in their process, in their decision-making, and in their way of doing things. A sort of top-down authoritarian method of decision-making. But I think that also needs to be seen in relation to the military situation that they were constantly in. They were, first of all, struggling since 1961 as a military force against a very brutal, very powerful dictatorship. And then after they became the leaders of the country, after they became the new government, they never had a moment's peace, really. Because even as early as 1980, their first full year in power, candidate Ronald Reagan was denouncing them and saying they were a cancer in the Western Hemisphere and they would have to be eliminated and we had to defend ourselves against them. They were being presented as devils, even at that early stage. And then in 1981, his first year in the presidency, he gave $19 million to the Contras in the form of covert aid. And the Sandinistas knew what was happening. And they knew that this would escalate. So that by the time of the elections, they were devoting, as I said, over 50% of their government funds to defense, which meant that there was very little left for the other programs. This verticalism, then, I think is due to the fact that they were always under siege, and they always had to be very concerned about security matters. There were other problems as well, problems that people have analyzed in terms of the agrarian reform, the early emphasis on the large, highly technical, very expensive state farms. The Sandinista agrarian reform at first put its emphasis on that, sort of as its agrarian policy. Then they were encouraging cooperatives, and several thousand agricultural cooperatives were formed, but that still left a lot of peasants out of the revolutionary process. And I think the Contras were able to gain ground among the peasants, especially in the very remote central areas of the country where they had not felt the benefits of the revolution. And so I think there were a number of factors involved in the defeat.